Welcome. My name's Trevor Kilpatrick. I'm Director of the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health. I'd like to thank you for all of you for joining us today. I begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, and pay my respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay tribute to some special guests who are here in the room today, people who have joined us to not only celebrate the launch of the Impact Report, but to share their personal experiences living with one of the many conditions that we as researchers at the Florey work on. These people are truly inspiring, and we thank them for their willingness to be here today. Now, this Impact launch is a new innovation for the Florey. The Institute is increasingly aware that it needs to be relevant to the broader community. And to be relevant, we need to be engaged. That engagement needs to be multifaceted in terms of reaching out to key stakeholders. And those stakeholders include partner organisations, University of Melbourne, Royal Melbourne Hospital, Austin Health, and also other medical research institutes, to name a few, to government, and also to industry. But most importantly, that engagement also reaches out to patients, their families, and supporters of the research we undertake, whether that be through lived experience or through altruism. Now, there's been much said and written recently about the term co-creation. To co-create is an important issue, and it can be orchestrated at multiple levels. At its worst, it's mere tokenism, but at its best, it's facilitation for mutual benefit. And in all honesty, I believe that we at the Florey are engaging with that latter concept rather than the former. And the three vignettes that we're presenting today are potent illustrations of that perspective, focusing on work that the Florey is undertaking in sepsis, in epilepsy, and in motor neuron disease. At the outset, I would like to thank Matt Stickland, Mandy McCracken, and Philip Stevens for not only sharing their stories with us today, but for the deep engagement that they've undertaken with our researchers, an interaction which I've observed has changed the nature of our researchers' scientific endeavours for the better because of that deep engagement. Any scientist wants their research to have meaningful outcomes and impact, and there is no better way to facilitate that than in the approach that Thanuja, Dharmadasa, Yugeesh, Lankadeva, and Reid are taking through their engagement with Matt, Mandy, and Philip. And I'm sure you'll agree with that sentiment after hearing today's presentations. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Thanuja Dharmadasa to open up the vignettes. Thanks very much.
The question is, what is motor neuron disease? And we know that motor neuron disease is the failure, or the fundamental failure, of the electrical wiring system of the body, the motor system. And the motor system involves everything that we need to do to actually voluntarily move, for example, or to eat or to speak. And we know that this involves the upper motor neurons. You can see them at the top there from the brain down to the spinal cord, as well as the lower motor neurons from the spinal cord out to the muscles. So to give you some context about this, if you wanted to move your hand, for example, you need to have electrical impulses that are going from that part of the brain all the way through to the spinal cord and down to contract your muscle. So it's a fundamental failure of both of these systems that's quite critical, and that we understand is critical in the development of this particular condition. So as a neurologist, I see patients with motor neuron disease every day in my clinic, and it's quite a compelling problem because it tends to strike people out of the blue. It happens at the prime of people's lives, and we don't really understand the cause for this fundamental failure. So we also classify motor neuron disease as a rare disorder, but actually the lifetime incidence of this is not infrequent. It's 1 in 300, and that incidence is actually now rising as our population ages. So it is a critical mass problem for our population to solve, particularly as we go on into the future. One of the things that might be surprising is that this is not actually a newly described condition. This fundamental failure was originally described in the 1800s by a neurologist called Jean-Marie Charcot. And he actually said, and I have to paraphrase him here, he said it was the most completely understood condition in the realm of clinical neurology. So we now know 200 years later that that is not quite the case, and MND has turned out to be quite a complex problem to solve. And I've just listed here some of the critical questions that we have as researchers, as clinicians, and that our patients face that really have made it difficult for us to target treatments and to really come up with really highly effective disease-modifying agents. So some of these questions are things like, well, how does this electrical failure actually begin? How does it lead to progression of the disease? Why do patients all look different to each other? And without this fundamental understanding, we really struggle to model this disease in our lab and also in our clinical research to be able to target our treatments. So our Florey research program is really trying to focus on some of these critical questions to unravel what is happening with these basic disease mechanisms so that we can try and target our treatment, and always our ultimate goal is to try and find a cure for this particular condition. So I'm going to give you one example, and this is really from our work that we're doing in clinical research. So again, it was Charcot, this neurologist, who suggested that MND probably starts in the brain, and now we do have a lot of critical information that suggests, well, this is a very, very important part of this disease and understanding this disease. So, this would be helpful if I show you this particular picture. This was the first scan that was done, brain scan that was done in the 1960s using an MRI, a magnetic resonance image scanner. And you can probably appreciate that you can see the outline of the brain, you can see the skull, you can see the differences in the tissue architecture, but it is a bit blurry and it's a little bit difficult to really appreciate anything in terms of the structure or the function of the brain if we were really to use this to tackle what's happening with this disease. So hopefully you can appreciate how far we've now come. The middle picture is taken with our 7 Tesla MRI machine, and this you can actually see, and I hope you can appreciate, how beautifully defined the brain now is. How we can see not only just that outline, but we can really see the undulations in the brain. We can see the differences in the tissue architecture. We can see some of the microarchitecture of the brain. And in the far right corner, you can actually see that we can map some of that electrical wiring system that we know is failing in motor neuron disease. So this is an incredible advancement in what we can do to understand the underlying problem with the motor system. And this is some of the research that we're using here at the Florey to try and address this. We also want to try and understand, well, what happens at the very start of this condition. We don't want to just see it in the middle of the condition. We need to find out why these systems are failing at the very start of this condition. And this is some of the things we're doing using our lab expertise and also using some of these tools, these unique tools, to try and bring this all together in a longitudinal fashion so we can answer this question for every patient that we see. So how do we actually bring all of this together? Well, what we're doing is we're trying to create a platform so that all our patients can have an opportunity to really integrate into this innovative and world-class research. And we want to make sure that this is matched with the best clinical care. So we're establishing a state-first facility through our links through Royal Melbourne Hospital to enable us to do that. So patients have access to the incredible work from the scientists all the way through to the clinical research, but also through our links to international research with Oxford and also with our other national bodies. So this is a really critical thing that we're trying to establish, and also this federated approach and beyond one clinic we think is essential to try and accelerate this impact of research. And this is what we'll be trying to bring now in the future. So we're really thankful, and we have to be very appreciative for all our supporters and funders, without which this really couldn't happen, and particularly Fight MND and MND Australia, who have supported us in this and enabled us to get this started. So thank you very much. Now I'd just like to introduce Matt, who is very generously giving us his time to talk a little bit about his experience living with the condition motor neuron disease.
Thank you, Thanuja. 9th of April 2015, 11:30 a.m. Sarah and I went to see a neurologist for the third time. I'd seen this neurologist. He suggested to bring Sarah along with me this time. I should have known something was going to be up, but I didn't trigger. But he gave me the news of you've got motor neuron disease. The average life expectancy is between 2 and 3 years. With a family of 3 kids, 11, 9 and 6 at that stage. Very distressing, very confronting, and that moment still sits with Sarah and I. We can't stand to look at the building as we drive past today, as I'm sure you can imagine. We went home, did the old Dr. Google, looked up basically no cure, no effective treatment, and more or less no hope. No need to feel sorry for ourselves. We still have to keep life as normal as possible for our children. So we kept on going and kept on persevering for quite a while. Within 2 years, I was fortunate enough to be recruited onto the Lighthouse trial, which was fully funded by by Fight M&D, and the Lighthouse trial was trying to identify whether a drug that attacks retroviruses used to treat HIV patients could also do the same thing with the retrovirus that is active in some patients with MD. And 7 years later, I'm still here today. I'm still on that drug, and my symptoms have definitely slowed right down, and I'm very, very grateful for that. In preparation for today's message, I spoke with Susan Mathers, who's the Director of Neurology at Calvary Institute, Calvary Hospital, and her words to me were, there were quite a few, but vitamin D funding has really put a pep in her step. She's really quite positive and optimistic. She's been in this space for 35 years, and she's said the biggest single thing that vitamin D funding has delivered is much more collaboration between all of the research centres in Australia, which is rather than reinventing the wheel in every research centre, there's a collaboration to make sure that doesn't happen. She also talked about the work being done behind the scenes with research, with technology and with other drug trials, and the ability of technology to allow more precise medicine, a more precise assessment of whether a drug will or can work on patients. So fast forward 9 years since my disease started or was diagnosed, I think we've come a long way, and today there now is hope that we're well on the way for at least an effective treatment for motor neuron, and maybe in 10 years' time, maybe we're much further progressed than today. So, thank you.
just again, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Matt for coming and sharing his story, which is, as you all kind of could hear, is such a powerful perspective for us, and it really drives our research and everything we need to do to get this towards a cure. So I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, Yugeesh, who will be talking about his work in sepsis.
Thank you, Thanuja, and it's an absolute honor and privilege to be speaking to you today. Today I would like to talk to you about an exciting story about a breakthrough discovery that we have made here at the Florey that is now starting to translate to have real-life impact on the treatment of sepsis in intensive care units. Now, just to provide a context about the medical problem that we're trying to address, sepsis is characterized by a dysregulated immune response to an underlying infection that can lead to life-threatening falls in our blood pressure and multiple vital organ dysfunction. It is the leading cause of death in intensive care units both in Australia and worldwide. Currently affects 50 million people every year and kills nearly 11 million people every year, which equates to 20% of all global deaths on an annual basis. The current treatments for sepsis in intensive care units is largely palliative or supportive in nature, where the clinicians try to resolve the underlying infection in the hope that the vital organs recover after this. The lack of targeted treatments for this condition is largely because its pathophysiology is elusive and complicated. However, living in an aging population with an increasing prevalence of antibiotic resistance, the annual incidence of the case of sepsis continues to rise. Therefore, development of new effective treatments is a global healthcare priority. Now, 3 years ago, we believe we made a breakthrough discovery at the Florey, where we found that if we use the sodium salt of vitamin C, which is sodium ascorbate, we can administer this at mega doses directly through a bloodstream, and that can reverse the detrimental effects of sepsis. Now, what is a megadose? We're talking about 2,500 to 5,000 oranges worth of vitamin C coursing through your bloodstream. So it's extraordinary stuff. So we've tried this. We've found it to be safe, feasible, and effective using our large mammalian models in our preclinical studies at the Florey, which almost instantaneously translated to a critically ill COVID-19 patient that had sepsis who became unresponsive to clinical drugs at Austin Health. That was run by Professor Ronaldo Bellomo, who's in the audience today, who's the director of intensive care research. This patient, when he was treated with megadose sodium ascorbate, showed a remarkable recovery from critical illness and was discharged from hospital without any adverse incidents shortly afterwards. Seeing the preclinical studies done at the Florey having a real-life impact on improving patient health outcomes was really gratifying at that stage. Since then, over the last 2 years, we have completed a randomized, double-blind clinical trial in 30 patients with sepsis at Austin Health, again run by Ronaldo and his team there. And I'll take you through a summary of what we have found so far. One of the best things we can do at medical research institutes like the Florey is that we can look inside vital organs in a way in which we can't do in patients. So we can find out what is really causing injury to vital organs during this deadly condition. Acute renal failure or kidney failure is a common phenotype in patients. 50% of patients have their kidneys failing during a very short period. At the Florey, we found that this is really mediated by a reduction in blood and oxygen delivery to the inner region of the kidney, which we call the renal medulla. Excitingly, treatment with megadose sodium ascorbate restores blood and oxygen delivery to this region, which translates to a rapid improvement in kidney function. And this seamlessly translated to patients with septic shock when we did the clinical trial at Austin Health, where patients treated with this drug showed significant increases in cumulative urinary output over a 24-hour period, which is a marker of improved kidney function. As I mentioned, sepsis is also characterized by life-threatening falls in blood pressure. And this is further complicated by the fact that these patients lose responsiveness to clinical drugs that are given to restore blood pressure, which can then deprive blood and oxygen supply to your extremities, causing gangrene to set in and necessitating amputations or multiple amputations in the case of Mandy, who we'll talk to later. Very excitingly, giving megadose sodium ascorbate improves the blood vessel's ability to respond to clinical drugs, where patients that were treated with megadose sodium ascorbate required less clinical drugs to maintain blood pressure, which is really exciting. And recently with Professor Clive May, who's also in the audience, we've started looking at the brain. And to see, because septic encephalopathy that's characterized by delirium and cognitive disturbances is also a clinical phenotype that complicates management. And what we found was that this condition is also driven by a reduction in blood supply and oxygen delivery to the frontal cortex of the brain, which is at the front end, which is really in charge of cognition and executive functioning. And that area of the brain becomes very hot during infections. Very excitingly, we recently found that giving megadose sodium ascorbate restores blood supply and oxygen delivery to that region of the brain and cools the brain towards normal. So this is a really strong data pack that we are developing with preclinical in conjunction with clinical studies, which we managed to kind of then take to the Australian federal government. And we were very fortunate to receive a $5 million grant from the Medical Research Switch Fund, which now enables us to translate this drug or advance this drug to multi-center, larger clinical trials across every state and territory of Australia over the next 3 to 4 years. It's a really exciting time for the Florey, and it's even a more exciting time for the patients with sepsis that needs a more effective drug. So watch this space. Thank you very much. Now it gives me an absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce Mandy McCracken, who's a sepsis survivor, so she can share her patient journey and what she and her family went through and what it's like to live with the long-term repercussions of sepsis. So please join me in welcoming Mandy to the stage. Thank you, Mandy.
Magic. Now, I have a microphone on my lapel because sometimes they're hard to hold, and also I've got very nice, expensive prosthetic legs, and standing behind a lectern means you don't all get to see them. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's wonderful to hear what you're all up to, and I'm excited for the next generation of sepsis patients. Unfortunately, I'm probably, a couple of years ahead of what you got up to. And so what I'd like to talk to you today is what it's like for one sepsis patient, is my story. Yugeesh has told us about the incredible numbers of sepsis that come through the door. And in a quick Google search that I did myself, 5,000 Australians die of sepsis every year, which is extraordinary numbers. Somebody told me once that it's more than breast cancer, prostate cancer, and the road toll combined. Yeah, that's extraordinary numbers when you think of it. And apparently 1/4 of ICU patients have sepsis. Again, this is stuff that me as a general person has no idea about, and it's quite extraordinary. So instead of talking about these massive numbers, I'll talk about my story. So let's pop a photo on. So I was 39 years old and 3 kids. Seems like that's the thing today. And life for me was going just perfectly. I was in the perfect nuclear family. We had the picket white fence, not quite. I made great chocolate brownies, and everything was going just as I had hoped. And of course, if anybody knows sepsis, it happens so quickly. So on a Wednesday night, I was feeling crook. I thought I had the flu. I had sort of flu symptoms, gastro symptoms going on. I took myself to bed. And then by Saturday morning, first thing in the morning, I was throwing up blood. I had the most incredible pain going on in my stomach, and all hell was breaking loose. And I called an ambulance, and halfway down the freeway from Kilmore, where I lived, I got swapped into a Mica ambulance, and they finally put the sirens on. That was exciting. And I made it down to the Northern Hospital, and thankfully they recognised it straight away as I came in the door, and I got put immediately into a coma. Because my blood pressure has crashed, as Yugeesh had mentioned. My blood pressure, I think, was 40. It was 40, somewhere in it. I'm not good with numbers. So I was immediately put into a coma, and I was in a coma for 10 days. And when I did wake up, my hands and feet were black, completely black as this floor black. It was extraordinary. My arm looked like it had been dipped in paint. There was a very distinct line. And my hands and feet started curling up like an Egyptian mummy's. It was just magic. It was incredible to watch happen. But of course, in amongst all of this fascinating situation going on, my family had to come and say goodbye to me. I was told that I would have virtually no hope to live. My children at the time, who were 9, 7 and 3, came in to say their last goodbyes, and that's how next to my head is my daughter's final goodbye too. But I managed to survive. I don't quite know how. My medical team were brilliant, and I pulled through. And yes, 10 days later I woke up, and I was in ICU for 6 weeks. I ended up having my amputations done at the Alfred. I go to Royal Melbourne for my prosthetics. So I've actually done 8 Melbourne hospitals, if you want to know the good ones, just come and I had to rebuild my life. So I had to learn how to swallow was my first thing. How do you do that? I had to learn how to sit up. I had to learn how to breathe on my own. I had to learn how to walk. I had to learn how to do everything. And along with that, my whole family had to learn how this all works as well. So here, this photo actually is the first time that we went to the beach, me as an amputee. It was the first time I was in the water. And what you don't see there is, that is Mount Martha Beach, and there was about 2,000 people on the beach behind me watching me walk into the water that day. And you can see by the posture of my entire family, it was actually incredibly daunting to be doing that. So one thing with sepsis, you might be talking these numbers, 11 million people around the world, but it actually affects so much more, the families that are involved, the friends that are involved, the work colleagues. It just has this incredible domino effect. And what is required to rebuild your life after this is just enormous. But now, okay, we've got another photo. Life moves on, and what I've discovered is the value of shared experience. I met a quadruple amputee, Matthew Ames. He was on TV whilst I was lying in bed after I'd just had my amputations. And he's in there, right next to me on my left. And he had been through sepsis 6 months prior to me, and he'd lived it and he'd survived it, and his family had gone through the same thing. And then we realised that there was another quadruple amputee that we knew, and another one that we knew, and another one, and we just met all these people through social media, actually, and also through nurses. All the nurses in ICU and all the nurses out there know that this stuff is going on, and they started spreading the word. So we started, this is the Quad Squad. We now have 400 quadruple amputees around the world. And then, the more we spread the word, the more we can support each other. And we've started to build this enormous support network. And now I've started a charity even to make sure that the next people that come through and have this sort of situation going on, be it motor neuron, be it MS, be it whatever disability you've got, our charity is called Get Started Disability Support. And the idea is that we all support each other so that we can bring the next person through the club. And unfortunately, sepsis keeps providing us with new club members. It would be really lovely, Yugeesh, and the sepsis team, you're all out there somewhere. I am so looking forward to the day that I don't have any more club members joining our Quad Squad, quadruple amputees. It would be absolutely magic if you could turn this around so that one single person doesn't have to deal with this situation, and be it 11 million people around the world. The impact that you can make out of this is just astronomical. And as I said to Yugeesh in the foyer today, have you thought about the impact on climate change, saving 11 million people? So you've got a big job ahead of yourself. So congratulations, and I thank you so much. And yes, if only I was a few years later and you could have saved me too. But I appreciate your work. Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to really thank Mandy again for sharing her story. And I know you don't like to be held accountable for being inspirational, but I can't help feel inspired by what you just said. It's really brave. And in a lot of ways, engaging with consumers gives us meaning to why we do what we do. And I think it extends beyond being a scientific leader, it transcends to students, research assistants, technicians, scientists, clinicians. We all play an integral role in this journey, as well as professional services of a medical research institute. And this is why we do what we do, so we can make a difference in people's lives. And Mandy, engaging with consumers like you really does add rocket fuel into our engines. It's almost like getting a mega dose of ascorbate into your bloodstream. So look, I hope you continue to engage with us. We would love to have you at our retreat for our sepsis program this year. And thank you again for sharing your story. Now I would like to introduce Professor Chris Reid to share his story on a remarkable epilepsy program that's going on in Florey. Thank you.
We're going to do it slightly differently in the epilepsy mission. I'm going to have Phil tell the story about little Fern. Fern's a girl that has HN1 epilepsy, which we work on, and very gratifying to see that we have actually had quite an immediate impact on Fern's life. So I'll introduce you to Phil, and then I'll tell the story of how we got there.
Thanks, Chris. I don't actually have any slides, but so like Chris said, my name's Phil. This is my wife Jules and my eldest daughter Fern. Unfortunately, sorry, Mandy, we've only got two. So she's got a younger sister called Minty as well. Fern had her first seizure when she was 6 months old. Jules was walking, out bushwalking, and she had what's called an atonic seizure. So she went all blue and floppy, and Jules just sort of thought she was dead, basically, and started CPR, but she woke up because it was a seizure a minute or two later, and Jules ran, I dare say, pretty quick to the nearest road and called me and called an ambulance, and that was kind of the start of it. We got quite lucky in a way that we then had 6 months seizure-free, and we thought that must have just been what's called a febrile seizure, which is pretty common. But over the next little while, our diagnoses kept kind of sliding worse and worse into, complex febrile epilepsy, into childhood epilepsy, and eventually we landed on having a rare HCM1 gene mutation epilepsy. I sort of wanted to just talk about a few moments, I suppose, to give you guys an idea of what it's like living with a kid with one of these epilepsies. So when Fern was between 2 and 3, her seizures really started getting out of control. We'd tried multiple medications which weren't working. They were getting more frequent and more severe, and developing a very worrying type of seizure where at the end of a big tonic-clonic seizure, she would collapse, stop breathing for multiple minutes, and just go blue from head to foot. And it really did look like we were just, emotions bubbling up. Just squash that down like I always do. That's my coping mechanism. It just looked like we were losing her over and over again, which we were vindicated some months later when we convinced the doctors to put an implantable loop recorder, it's called, in her. And I got a phone call from Sydney one day saying, "Are you with Fern?" I went, "I'm not, but I'm on the way to daycare. She's just had a seizure." And they said, "Oh, okay, and she all good?" I said, "Yeah, I think so." The daycare said it was just a normal seizure. And he said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Why?" He goes, "Oh, she had a 42-second heart pause. So she was effectively had zero output for 42 seconds. And speaking to her quite mild-mannered cardiologist about that sometime later, I said, "Is that normal? Is that a bad one?" And he said, "It's an effing doozy." So take that as a yes, that was a bad one. So during that period, obviously we were nervous wrecks, and that was pretty much, where we sort of hit rock bottom in terms of worry and everything. But luckily, we sort of managed to scrape through for a couple of months, and Fern got a pacemaker put in. And so we managed to move on from that really life and death situation into more of a management and trying to figure out what was actually going on. And so multiple sort of long studies and stays at Westmead in Sydney. Later, we eventually got our HCN1 diagnosis, which on one hand was devastating in a way that it's a lifelong sort of incurable genetic problem, but on another hand, very empowering to have the knowledge about what's actually going on. And it wasn't long before, probably about 8 seconds, before my mum was texting me saying, "Oh, have you been in contact with Chris and Lauren down at the Florey Institute?" And, "Oh, don't worry, I've emailed them." So, so we got in touch with these guys pretty quick, and jumped on a Zoom call, and I was sort of relaying pretty much this exact same story to them. And Chris asked, "Oh, and what medications is Fern on?" And I said, "Oh, she's currently on whatever it was, Epilum, blah blah blah, and lamotrigine." And I saw him just look at Lauren, and I was like, "What?" And he's like, "Well, obviously we're not doctors, we can't say anything, but we've just done this study and we've found that in epilepsies very similar to Fern's, lamotrigine can make things worse." So, I don't think I even waited to talk to the neurologist. I think I started titrating off that pretty quickly. So that was around her 4th birthday sometime, and she's 12 weeks seizure free today. She had one, and I don't count it because it was COVID, so she would be longer if she hadn't had a bout of COVID whilst coming down. But we just couldn't be more thankful that these guys were doing that research. It's not only changed her seizure frequency, her side effects are so much less, her development's more normal. She's lost a bad tremor that she had. Her preschool attendance has been 100% this year, which means that we can work. Her social development, everything's just turned a massive corner from the minute we had that conversation. One detail that I think people miss is we might have stumbled across this formulation of medication ourselves, and that still would have been a fantastic result. But the fact that these guys could tell us the hows and the whys about why that's happening is just as important as that in itself, because it gives us so much hope now for the future. That she'll have a long and fulfilling life now, and Chris has promised me heaps more precision medicines to come. So I'll let him talk a little bit more about what's going on there.
So the moral of the story is always listen to your mother. So, look, it was always kind of hard to follow that. Thank you so much, Phil. But I think it's important that I give you a really short rendition of the story to the point that we got where we could help Fern. And that started with another gloriously gorgeous girl called Ebony. Ebony is a girl that has HN1 epilepsy, which is the same epilepsy that Fern has. You can see her there being held by Chase and Lauren and Ming, just to highlight that this isn't just me that's working, it's a team. Ebony had severe epilepsy, was diagnosed about 6 years ago at a point where we had absolutely zero idea about what IGN epilepsy was. Tim, her dad, approached me about 5.5 years ago, and we raised a little bit of money, and we did a lot of different types of work, but the primary thing that we did was to generate a mouse model. And that mouse model was based on exactly the same mutation that Ebony has. And there's a sort of nice little anecdote here. The first time Ellie, who was Ebony's mum, saw the mouse, she called it the Ebony mouse. And it's been a hard tag to lose. So the Ebony mouse, it remains. And this mouse really has been very, very helpful in both understanding the disease, but also for understanding how medications can work. So as Phil has just described, these patients are refractory to seizures. They don't respond to medication. So what tends to happen, or what we've called, is the anti-seizure medication lottery. They get tried on one, it doesn't work. They get tried on another, it doesn't work. They get put two together, etc. And it's really difficult at an individual level to understand what's going on because of the things that we've talked about. You know, Fern got COVID, she got sick, etc. And because they're so rare, it's hard to do population things. Now, the benefit of the mouse is that we can breed many of them. We can breed as many mice as we need to. And Ebony went through almost exactly the same story that Fern went through. She was placed on the same drug, lamotrigine, and you can see on the chart there the number of seizures per day. These were measured by her dad, so it is anecdotal, but it certainly wasn't helping the seizures, and if anything, as the dose went higher, it got worse. As I said, with the mouse, we can do it in a really controlled manner. We can look at many drugs, and the drugs that you can see on the bottom are drugs that are prescribed commonly for epilepsy patients. On the axis there is really just the seizure susceptibility of the mouse, or at least the marker of that. And what you can see is that there's a series of drugs that work on the mouse. And then there's a series of drugs that actually make things worse. And in fact, if you inject these drugs, they'll actually cause seizures in this particular mouse model. And included in that is lamotrigine, which is what Fern and Ebony were on. So we can be pretty confident that the lamotrigine was actually causing an epilepsy. And it's not a problem with the neurologist. This is a drug that's really effective. It would be effective in all this population, but in this really specific subpopulation of epilepsy, it's clearly not. It's not just having an impact in Australia. This is the HEN Epilepsy Warrior website, and it's an exchange between a Polish mum and a South African mum. And I'm not going to draw you into all the details, but really the sort of despair that these patients feel when these poor children are having a number of seizures in today. But what was really nice is our paper was placed on this website, not known, actually unbeknownst to us. The lady in South Africa took it to her neurologist. They changed her medication. In that case, it was carbamazepine, and she's actually been seizure-free for almost 12 months. So the impact is beyond our shores. So to finish off, it's an important point. Fern and Ebony are important individuals, but their cause of epilepsy is rare, but the actual disease itself is not that rare. The collective term for this disease is developmental epileptic encephalopathy, and it's thought to occur in about 1 in 600 births. Based on some of the work that's been done here, is that it's approximately 500 newly diagnosed patients per year. And you remember that these are children that are affected right from the word go. They have a massive impact on the children, obviously on the carers, but also on the medical fraternity, because they spend a lot of time in hospital. I think we can go further. I know we can. Our work's not finished. Precision medicine is something that we've been talking about and something that we're pursuing actively. But also the same model that I just showed here, I think we can apply to the other genetic aspects to it. So that's all I had to say. I'll say thank you to Phil so much for providing Fern's story for us. And my next job, I think, is to hand over to Trevor and to say thank you, you guys, for this.
Wow, how can one follow that? I think it's important to say a few things, though. The first is that over the last couple of years we've been engaged in what we call a Future Florey project. And at its core, it's really about changing things for the better and being relevant and being part of the community. And I think that today says it all from that perspective. In some ways, today was an experiment, but as you would agree, I think it's been a very successful experiment and gives us a perspective of where we're trying to go in terms of this perspective of engagement and co-creation. At the outset, I'd like to pay tribute to Georgia Brown, who's in charge of media and comms, for actually coming up with the idea of today. And that's in the spirit of the Future Florey, to make sure that we're not just resting on our laurels of the past, we're actually being avant-garde and actually thinking about how we need to reach out to the community in the ways that we haven't done before. And actually, to paraphrase Phil, I think that it's important to really think about how we do that. In a way, Phil found us, but in the future, we want to be out there such that the community understands we have a leadership role in research related to neuroscience and mental health. And so it's obvious that we're port of call, rather than people having to search for answers. And that's part of the transformation we're on about for the future. I'd really like to extend thanks to Mandy, Matt and Phil, because I think that you've inspired us. Your stories really are very telling. They pull at the heartstrings, and obviously and appropriately so. And I'd like to thank you for your courage and your resilience in coming before us today on behalf of yourselves and your family. Really, really appreciative. And I think the researchers have also indicated their thanks and really genuinely indicated that the interactions are meaningful. They're not tokenism. And I think that it reflects that we are learning that there's so much to be gained from deep interactions of this nature. And as Yugeesh indicated, it's not just the lead scientists, it's the whole team who understand why they're doing what they're doing. Now, this is also a reflection on the deep understanding of these disorders which we need to actually continue to promulgate and investigate. Translation is incredibly important, but also discovery is incredibly important. And each of these stories reflects deep interrogation of fundamental biological principles and then translating for benefit. And I think it's that nexus which the Florey can do so well in the future, reflecting that we know how to discover, but we also need to know what should be translated from what we discover and how to translate it. And I think that this is the sort of engagement that we're trying to improve for the future, which really represents the co-creation, which is relevant for the studies which we're now undertaking for community benefit. Now also it's wonderful to see some of our donors in the audience tonight. I know many of you have been contributing to the Florey for many years, and on behalf of the researchers in the auditorium tonight, I'd like to thank you, because that gives us the opportunity, as Chris was saying, to actually follow our nose at times. There's a prosaic aspect to research in terms of getting a grant, but in addition, we also need that freedom to actually follow a lead, which might not be fully encapsulated or fully developed, but that's the spark of discovery, which then ultimately leads to the next grant, and then ultimately the big program of research, which leads to translation. And that's where philanthropy and support is just so important. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity of seeing some of our fundraising appeals, if you're interested in supporting some of our research, outside will be some of our philanthropy staff to engage, to have a discussion as to how that might be brought to bear. Or alternatively, we also have a link to expedite any support which you would be interested in giving, and that would be very gratefully acknowledged. So thanks once again for coming tonight. It's really appreciated that you've taken the time to be with us and to hear about these journeys. And please join us for canopies and cocktails outside, and also the opportunity to mingle and interact with some of our lead researchers and to understand the journeys that they're undertaking in exploring solutions for some of the wicked problems in terms of neuroscience and mental health that we're trying to solve. So thanks very much for your attendance tonight, and especially to all of our participants. Very much thankful for that. Thank you.